Hi, Sayer G here, and I would love to talk today about a topic that's been coming up a lot lately, which is about exosomes, or these exceedingly small nanoparticles that are secreted by all the cells in our body and which are in some way reminiscent of viruses. In fact, one of the many names for exosomes include virus-like particles, in part because when you actually look at these particles, they're indistinguishable at times from viruses. And so the question comes up, are viruses exosomes? Or are exosomes essentially viruses? And so when you start having this question and starting to look at the research, it becomes clear that germ theory, if you will, is no longer founded on a very solid biomedical substrate, meaning there has been a profound change over time due to increasingly higher resolution instrumentation, such as electron microscopes, that enable us to see so far down in scale that we almost start to lose our bearings and we start to wonder what is actually self, what is other. And this happened, of course, is a big part of my advocacy at the beginning of the 21st century. In 2000, when you go on pubmed.gov, you'll see all these studies start to be published on the microbiome. The microbiome is amazing, and that's a good example of where without the right instrumentation, we can't actually see what's going on, because in 2000, there was this profound discovery that there are literally trillions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that are comprising who we are, only we don't see those. We see the flesh suit that I'm wearing. We see the eukaryotic cells, right, that are solid, visible. Whereas there are trillions of these, quote, germs that are even constituting something of an auric cloud around us. In fact, they call it the microbial cloud, several inches off of our form. Now, of course, given the present coronavirus hysteria, any thought of there being a germ that is coming off of a human is in some way terrifying to those who don't understand that, for example, viruses are defined as obligate parasites. And that's even a stretch, meaning they're not actively parasitically coming to get us from outside because they don't have a motive force, right? They don't actually have an ability to replicate without a cell. So technically, the notion that these particles are out there trying to get us, and that maybe if they're lucky enough might be carried on an aerosol droplet from someone's cough or on the wind, and then would somehow find a way to penetrate the rather profound force field of a cell, assuming the cells are healthy, and that those particles then go in and then they potentially kill and destroy our cells. This concept is actually based on what you might even call a mythology. I mean, if we were in the dark ages and we believed there were demons out there that could infect us and that were invisible, then, we would probably be not that far off from what's going on with coronavirus, because of course, we're being told that these particles, again, they're invisible unless you happen to be a modern day medical sorcerer and can divine whether the particles are there and what the safe distance is to be between people or away from one another. Or maybe there's some magical potion that they inject into you and that confers some kind of special, resistance. Like this whole mythology that is now being popularized and being, projected throughout the world is fundamentally mythological. It's really based on some fundamental misunderstandings of what's happening on a cellular level. But here's the thing, is that when we start getting into the nanometer scale, it's so small that it's very hard to understand what it is we're looking at. What I mean by that, if you look at an electron microscope, it literally has a resolution down to electrons. And so at that scale, what we're seeing is fundamentally frozen. It's not like we're observing through a conventional microscope the squiggling of little bacteria where you're seeing living things. when you're getting down to the subcellular level, which is fundamentally what exosomes are, right? They're just these little teeny dots that actually, in many ways, are viral-like, and everything sort of falls apart because you go down a few more levels, you're at the quantum level, and we're going to be talking mysticism and what might sound like mumbo jumbo to understand what's happening. And so when we have immunological concepts and virology and vaccinology all based on, these basic assumptions about the body that are outdated and didn't account for these fundamental discoveries of really microbiology, then we're basing much of what we believe to be true off of what are essentially ancient myths and fears, like more of a tribal consciousness. And that's what we're seeing with social distancing, which is, of course, this notion that somehow separating ourselves 6 feet from one another is going to somehow flatten the curve, the epidemiological curve, this inevitable projection of numbers increasing and death counts increasing, unless we abide by these fundamental superstitious concepts and policies. So when it comes to exosomes, the reality is we don't fundamentally know what they are, nor do we fundamentally understand what viruses are. But when you start getting into the science of exosomes, you find that some exosomes are literally indistinguishable from viruses. Now, some of these exosomes actually have viral nucleic acids within them, but we don't even know any longer what the viruses are, meaning viruses, as conventionally understood, may actually just be exosomes, and exosomes may be in place to serve a larger requirement of the sort of spiral of life. I don't like to call it the tree of life because it's more of like an open access, horizontally connected spiral where, all the kingdoms of life, plants, animals, fungi, for example, are sharing their genetic information constantly in real time. Now in Regenerate, I get into this because it's the basis for one of the more beautiful things that I've noticed, which is that if you look at certain plants like the walnut, which has this beautiful cranium-like shell and the bihemispheric meat of the walnut itself, and then you see the corpus callosum-like structure in the middle, and you have this meninges-like webbing, and you look at the nutritional content, it's high in omega-3 fats, which are very beneficial for the brain. In fact, without adequate omega-3, the brain doesn't function. So what is that about? Just pure accident or a joke that God and Mother Nature is playing on us? No, well, now we know there's a mechanism, which is exosomes, these viral-like particles, transfer genetic information between the kingdoms of life. So, for example, the walnut tree produces this walnut ostensibly for reproduction and to feed the animals that will take over the dispersal of those seeds, so that basically the animals in exchange for this amazing nutriment, which has literally software that also feeds our body, we disperse its seeds. So it's this amazing interdependence or reciprocal altruism. And over time, because the exosomes, which again are viral-like particles that are exuded by all the living things on the planet, will actually send genetic information to the other plant or animal. So you have this bridge that's formed, because previous to this, of course, this fetishization of protein coding genes in the nucleus of the cells of living things, the idea was you couldn't really you couldn't transfer horizontally information. Had to go through the germline, right? Had to be through reproduction, sexual reproduction in the case of many of these plants and animals, and that there was no way to share the information. There wasn't this promiscuity. But that's what viruses and exosomes have essentially undermined, because information is transferable horizontally. Now, when we think about viruses, that's scary. Oh my, we don't want bad information. And there may be some truth to that. But when you look at it from the other side and understand that the actual much worshipped protein coding genes of the human genome are approximately 7 to 11% retroviral in origin. Clearly, they can't be so bad if we wouldn't exist without them. The same is true for the placenta of mammals. It apparently only exists because of retroviral sequences. And so the idea is that viruses were fundamental to help us become this amazing miracle technology that we are today. And so when we start to understand that and understand other elements of our genome, the way that they, like retroposones, which actually are transposones that jump from place to place, like viruses, then we start to understand that actually viruses aren't as scary as we thought. Let's look at it from the perspective of the number of viruses in the body. There's literally an order of magnitude more viruses in our body than bacteria. We already know there are more bacteria, or at least as many bacteria as human cells. So we are more viral than we are human. So let's give the viruses some credit. It's called the virome. And if you look at the work of Herbert Skip Virgin, who's one of the preeminent virologists on the planet, he's done this amazing lecture on the mammalian virome as part of an NIH series. He goes deeply into how many of the viruses that we were told for so long are deadly. The only thing we can do is prevent infection through, vaccines perhaps, or some type of antiviral disinfectant or drug, that without those viruses, we would actually end up developing cancer, or our immune systems would become more susceptible to types of bacteria that are deadly. So the idea is viruses are actually part of the natural microbiome cycle. And technically, many of the viruses, which are called bacteriophages, exist at the topmost hierarchy of the predation within the microbiome. So the viruses are actually turning over the bacteria. And so they're helping to, in a way, cultivate the ideal microbial communities within the body, which feed, of course, the incredible genetic capabilities that we know bacteria confer to the human body, such as degrading toxicants or synthesizing essential vitamins or producing immune factors. I mean, let's look at it this way, because this is what's really at stake. Bacteria, viruses, fungi, they are like the amazing community at the forest floor that help to break down, right? To help to, regenerate the whole system. So without these incredible helpers, then theoretically we can't clear the biomass of, for example, cells that have been sickened with EMF or nutritional incompatibilities or toxicants. And over time, without adequate selections of these bacteria and viruses, theoretically, we can't even clear the old bad tissue. We might end up with accumulation of toxicants within the cells. We might actually see changes within the cell consistent with cancer. So the idea is that we do need these little critters, if you will, in order to continually promote regeneration. Because regeneration is actually based on a system. It's called a dissipative structure. It's like a flame. Constantly there's a destruction or breaking down, an expending, an entropy, and then there's a negentropy. There's a building up. There's a regeneration. And so their life and death, yin and yang, are in a cycle. So to identify parts of us that happen to be part of the destructive, regenerative side as bad, that now we have to kill, or maybe select one out of hundreds of thousands of them, like coronavirus, and say, this is the one that's so bad that's going to kill us all. And let's shut down the world over it. Let's strip all the civil liberties, etc., is so just ludicrous, ultimately, from the perspective of, I'll call it the new biology, but it's the biology that's always been here, right? There's been the projected false narrative, old world biology, and the medical superstructure that formed on top of it, that's influenced the development of a global transnational pharmaceutical cartel, infiltrated the medical institutions, the textbooks, the science, the standard of care, the insurance industries, our government, it's just obviously where we're at right now. Now, let's just reference some very interesting fact, which is in Revelations, there's a passage talking about where at the end of times, the merchants of the world will control the nations of the world through pharmacia. Now, pharmacia also meant sorcery. Pharmacia meant the poisoner. It meant the person who's doing witchcraft and who's sort of, mesmerizing the public. So we have even in the Bible, apparently in Revelations, which was quite an interesting, part of the Bible, aspects of the story that we're seeing here today. So again, we need a bad guy. We need a fall guy. 5G is going to induce cell changes that are going to so dramatically alter the structure and function of the cell because, by the way, 60 gigahertz wavelengths are going to be absorbed up to 98% in oxygen molecules, right? So you're dealing with ranges of radiation that are going to cause such a dramatic change in the basic structure of the human body. It's founded on water, H2O. And you don't even have to go to the 60 gigahertz. You can go to the regular Bluetooth-enabled Wi-Fi or microwave oven wavelength of 2.4 gigahertz or 2.45. That is working to cook your food because it is going to heat the water molecules, changing the structure and function. So Wi-Fi, which right now this broadcast is hardwired for a reason, is basically causing cell damage. And then the cell damage may, as Dr. Thomas Cowan states, cause the cell to literally excrete or poop out certain nucleic acids, which then in the form of exosomes appear to be viral in the sense that they will cause a false positive in a PCR test, which, as we've referenced with David Crow's work, is a manufacturing method. It's not meant to ascertain the presence or absence of a virus. It never was. It's absolutely asinine to assume that those tests are able to isolate a specific form of coronavirus. It was never established that a specific coronavirus strain in Wuhan had infected multiple people. They never followed the coached postulates of isolating that virus, reintroducing it, infecting animals, causing the same disease, and then taking the virus out again, purifying it, and proving that that's what was originally in the people that were infected with this unique form, right, of respiratory arrest. So we then never saw any basic validation of the concept that there is a COVID-19 as some monolithic entity that's spreading around the world on its own motive force somehow, and that this whole narrative was spun out of mere vapor. And really, fundamentally, we're talking about an epidemic of testing, right? This is an epidemic of reifying a myth through the sleight of hand of these tests, which don't even have the innate ability to ascertain whether there is this thing. It's so labyrinthine and so baseless at this point that if people take the fire hose mainstream media narrative at face value, then unfortunately all is lost, right? This ideological fluoride, that's what I'd like to call that. So exosomes help us to better understand fundamentally a new way of looking at this contagion model, because here's an example. There is research on acetaminophen or Tylenol induced damage, okay, in an animal model where they take the exosomes that are produced, right, these little nanoparticles that look like viruses, and then they give those exosomes to a healthy animal, and that animal starts to have very similar effects as if they've been poisoned. Now, the exosomes aren't carrying Tylenol to those animals. The information, however, is being transferred over to the animal. Now, the information may be in the form of messenger RNA or microRNA, DNA, and other things that are naturally found in exosomes, because they don't just have microRNA. Needless to say, all that information is being transferred over to the animals that were healthy and not poisoned with Tylenol, and they start to get symptoms of sickness. Why would that be? Many ways to describe this. Let's say you get a text message not intended for you saying that someone is going to come to your house and kill you. and you believe it. Well, your body goes through all the physiological symptoms of as if this is real. And then later someone says, this was a sick joke. I'm sorry, that's not happening. And suddenly you feel like, oh my, I'm so relieved. Maybe that's an example, is that poisoned animal is secreting exosomes as messengers inter-individual, meaning within the species of, let's say, rats. It's getting the message over to another rat that, hey, watch out, I've been poisoned, and this is something your body now needs to prepare for. So it starts to activate pathways which cause what you might call something like a sickness syndrome. Detoxification pathways are activated, which cause the animal to have malaise, maybe fever, symptoms of trying to exude toxicants. And so that could look very much like a virus infecting the animal. In fact, if you were to isolate the particles, you might find that they look very much like viruses. You might find nucleic acids within them that are transferred over to the animal that now was healthy, but now thinks it's going to get poisoned with Tylenol. And it may cause literally those animal cells to produce the same nucleic acids. This is known to happen because functional messenger RNA can be transferred over from an animal to another, which will then cause it to produce actual protein, as if their own genes had decided to produce that protein. It's very similar to what, say, a infectious particle idea of a virus going over from one animal to another can produce. So another interesting study showed that an animal who had potentially a harm from a lung transplant, when those exosomes were transferred over to the other healthy animal, it was as if it also had lung injury. So we're seeing an example of what can be talked about in a larger framework called xenohormesis. The idea, let's say that there's a type of grape that's starting to feel impending changes in the environment, drought, okay, or heat, okay, and it produces resveratrol, which is a resilience phytocompound, which then when animals consume it, their body activates longevity pathways similar to caloric restriction. It's as if the plant is communicating to the animal, watch out, what's going to happen next is you're going to have to deal with these shortening resources and greater environmental challenges, so you better activate resilience pathways in your body. So that's an example of xenohormesis. In Regenerate, I talk about this because you have many of the traditional polyphenols like curcumin and turmeric, you have EGCG in green tea, you have resveratrol and things like grapes. And those compounds are so therapeutic for animals for whatever reason. Well, one explanation is because they're conferring these longevity factors over to the animals that when they're healthier, those plants become healthier. Because what do grapes have? They have seeds. So animals that eat the seeds disperse those for the plant, and in exchange, that animal gets what is essentially an upgrade to its own genetic information. So that's the concept. So when it comes down to applying this framework to what could be perceived as pathogenicity or contagion, we can start to understand that actually it's as if animals that are under duress, cellularly challenged, they've been exposed to toxicants, EMF, whatever it is, they produce informational signals that are passed over through exosomes that I can call now xenogens, as if a combination of the word xeno, hormesis or xenobiotic, and pathogen. So what we're saying essentially is that there may have been a profound misconception about what exosomes fundamentally are from the outset, is that they would see in animals and in humans that certain informational particles are being transferred over within groups that induce symptoms that seem to imply there's an infectious particle causing them. When instead we can understand that when the symptoms of, let's say, an infection are understood not to be the disease itself, but rather an attempt for the body to heal and protect itself, which is fundamental to the concept, right, of natural medicine, is that then we start to understand fundamentally the difference between an infection model versus a model that understands sort of almost the innate intelligence and logic of life. And that, in fact, the ability to transfer information horizontally between individuals, species, and even kingdoms of life is what has enabled this vast miracle to exist since the beginning of time. Consider that vaccines have only been used en masse for 100 or so years. How did we get to the survivability as a species over eons without vaccines if they were that life-saving? Can we consider that? Why are there multiple boosters of MMR? Because they don't confer lasting immunity. Whereas those who had measles, which is the natural process of developing immunological tolerance, right? And immunological homeostasis and resilience is you are needing to be exposed to natural pathogens, but in this case, we can call them xenogens, meaning humans may exude viral-like particles as a way to communicate resilience factors within the herd. So even herd immunity might be reconceived. And this is very interesting because when you think about the history of diseases, when one really plumbs the depths of the literature and goes granular and tries to understand what these viral particles are and tries to prove that viral particles are capable of causing disease within the framework of the conventional, classical, if you will, disease theory model, there's always these amazing exceptions. Why is it that with seasonal flu, the vast majority of people don't get infected? Why are we not looking at that? Is it just because they have greater immune systems? Even if that were true, that's an amazing discovery. We should be focusing on the fact that there's so many people that are asymptomatic or that were, quote, carriers or were exposed to these xenogens, call them infectious particles, call them exosomes, and they don't get sick. Or some of them do experience a modulation, a xenohermetic modulation of their immune system. They might get a mild symptom for a day or a moment, and then they develop even greater resilience. So instead of looking at those particles, if you will, as the enemy, the cause of inexorable lethality, and start to understand better what could be the basis for a new vision of how viruses work, how exosomes work, then we start to better understand a number of things. Okay, one of them is we have to sustain and support our immunity the best that we can. We want to support it by limiting exposure to all the adverse effects that, like I said earlier, are being used as the fall guy. We don't want to talk about the adverse effects of 5G or the 100,000 pollutants in our environment daily, right? Or the nutritional deficiencies or toxicant exposures of GMO foods. We don't want to look at all the damage caused by medical interventions. Arguably, one of the top 3 causes of death on the planet are correctly prescribed drugs and things like vaccination. Okay, so these are the things that are causing harm to our body and our cells. And it's a miracle we're doing so well considering. And yet it's so easy to say there's this invisible particle, coronavirus this year, or maybe it's SARS, or maybe it's Zika, maybe it's Ebola. Let's just blame that little thing that no one else can say is even there unless they have some kind of, special device or special test. I mean, this is theater of the most grotesque, political theater, what's going on in that perspective. So let's look at that. Let's look at supporting our body with vitamin D. Why is it that latitudinally during the fall and winter months when people are getting even less sun exposure than they already are, because most people work in boxes, why do we get this cyclical experience of influenza? Could we look at it as a very clear-cut example of vitamin D-related deficiency, i.e. sunlight deficiency, i.e. not being plugged into the grounding that our body needs to take in all those great negative ions we need to keep ourselves in a good oxidative state, not to mention 1,000 other things like modulating inflammation? That's another example, something as simple as pennies a day of the surrogate for sunlight, vitamin D, right? could potentially cause millions of people to not have to go through what is almost like the equivalent of a scurvy-like near-death experience. Because take away vitamin C and you get a near-death experience. No one is talking about that, especially given that Dr. Andrew Saul, the Orthomolecular Journal and Society have been talking about the life-saving effects of vitamin C, which we don't produce. That we can take pennies a day worth, which could do infinitely more, theoretically, than any of these ridiculous solutions that are being offered by folks like the Gates Foundation, which is injecting a untested experimental vaccine in the category of RNA DNA vaccines, which are basically transhumanistic in the sense that they alter your DNA RNA patterns in order to try to induce some type of change in your body. They're selling it as protective or life-saving, but the reality is you don't tinker with people's DNA and RNA in this way unless you want to potentially risk profound unintended adverse effects. Now, this is part of the power of the discovery of exosomes, people, because when they realized post end of the first draft of the Human Genome Project, right? So that's 2005. Protein coding genes do not have enough information in them to account for the existence of even a single cell in the body. There's 100,000 cells in proteins in each cell of the human body, and there's only about 20,000 protein coding genes. So what they found was that the quote junk DNA, the 98% that wasn't, what they thought coding for anything important, much of it codes for RNA, including microRNAs, which, despite the diminutive term micro, have the ability, in theory, to supervene or control and orchestrate the expression of the majority of the protein coding genes in our body. So they are meta-level important, master regulators. That is essentially why biotech, for example, in the case of the new GMO corn that Dow and Bayer collaborated on, which is the RNI corn, it's the RNA interference system corn. That's why they're moving to vaccines that can basically silence entire swaths of genome expression through interfering with RNA, messenger RNA, preventing it from transcribing proteins. So exosomes are only so powerful because they contain microRNAs in them. And that is another reason why, when it comes to RNA vaccines, they're focusing on them right now as a way to control and alter our gene expression. So I just want people to be aware of that part of this, because the discussion around what are viruses, what are exosomes, also plays into what the biotech communities have already known to be the next best way to control life on this planet. The entire biosphere of, the arable surface of our land may eventually be covered by these RNAi frankenfoods, which of course have profound unintended adverse effects on those who eat them because they have RNA interfering molecules. They have microRNA, they have double-stranded RNA that will potentially shut down the expression of a very important set of genetic pathways and cell signaling pathways, receptors within our body. And that's the same with the RNA and DNA vaccines presently being developed by, companies, 7 of which have been funded by Bill Gates in the name of several $billions of his quote investment, his philanthropic investment. How to present to the public the concepts of exosomes as being viral-like, if not fundamentally undermining the entire concept that there is such a thing as a totally exogenous and yet somehow all-powerful, penetrative, invisible viral particle that, again, we have shut down the entire world over, when it could very well just be that they are being exuded by our own cells, for the most part, in a desperate attempt to protect us from what is the continuing scaling of adverse effects on our biology. It could be that simple, really. I'm not saying that is the only explanation, and I do know that there are still ways of looking at this where maybe there's an exception. Maybe there's a bioweapons facility which has been working on this for at least 50 years that has this new gain of function lethality tie it in with high transmissibility. Take a common cold virus and add in a quote more lethal one. Maybe that's basically exosome research, and they're trying to develop a lethal exosome, because I prefer that terminology now that I better understand exosomes. Needless to say, I know this has been very technical, but I hope that you're getting something from this that will help to ultimately bring us to a place of greater clarity around what is or isn't the actual threat represented by coronavirus, and why a vaccine-based requirement for lifting the global lockdown is potentially patently absurd given the biology we're speaking to. All right, I hope this has helped.